The call from the ruins. Jace's mind raced as he stood in the middle of the crumbling city. The weight of the decision hung on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. The radio still crackled with static, but the voice on the other end was what anchored him here. It was a small, fragile call for help, one that shattered his focus, drawing him deeper into the ruins. He glanced over at the map again, searching for the faint trace of hope that might guide him. The dead zone he was in, Zone Red 7, had been deemed uninhabitable. Once, this had been a bustling city full of life, with markets filled with traders, children laughing in the streets, and technology that bridged the worlds of human and alien alike. But now, it was all just a ghost town, a shell of a place where only the echoes of the past remained. He couldn't even remember how long it had been since the war, maybe a year, maybe more. Time had no meaning here. The signal was weak, but it was there, faint, desperate, real. Jace's boots crunched over the broken pavement as he walked toward the heart of the devastation. He moved slowly, eyes scanning his surroundings, always alert, always cautious. The wind had picked up, swirling dust and ash through the ruins. His breath quickened as he passed broken buildings that once housed families, their walls now cracked and peeling. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The thought of turning back gnawed at him, but he knew he couldn't. Not now. Not with the voice of the child still echoing in his mind. A sound from the radio pulled him back into the moment. Sharper now. My mama, ... She's still breathing, but I can't wake her up, the voice whispered, barely audible through the static. Jace's stomach twisted. He had to be sure. He had to find them. Jace adjusted his pack, checking for the few supplies he had left. There was water, a small emergency heater, and a couple of energy bars. That was all. Not enough to last if he had to stay long. The radio crackled again, and the voice came through, more urgent this time, but still faint. I think the building is going to fall soon, the girl said, her words shaking. Mama said I shouldn't use it, but I thought maybe you could help. Jace's throat tightened, and for a moment, he stood still, staring at the blank horizon. The storm was coming. The winds were howling like predators circling in the distance, and every instinct inside him screamed to turn around. But the radio was still on. The little girl's voice was still there, faint but clear. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he made the decision. He would go with each step. The city seemed to close in on him, its broken structures looming like dark figures. In the distance, the ground beneath him was unstable, each footstep sending echoes through the wreckage. The building they were in was still a ways off, but Jace didn't stop to think. He couldn't afford to. His mind was consumed with one thought, getting to them before the storm did. As he neared the site of the signal, the radio crackled again. Please hurry, please. The little girl's voice whispered desperately. Jace's hand clenched. Around the radio he had to move faster. The ruins were dangerous, but not nearly as dangerous as what was coming. He scanned the area, his eyes darting over every broken wall and fallen beam. The city had long since lost its purpose, but there was still a haunting beauty to the place, even in its death. And then, through the fog of his thoughts, Jace saw it. A small shape in the distance, a flash of light in the shadows. It was her, the little girl. He quickened his pace, weaving through the debris. He had no idea how much time had passed. Minutes, hours. It didn't matter. He had to get there. The radio crackled again, and the voice was even weaker now, fading in and out like a distant echo. My mama, ... She's still under the rubble. Please help her, ... Jace's heart sank. He picked up the pace again, heart racing in time with his steps. The last thing he needed was to be too late. The ruins weren't just unstable, they were a trap. One wrong move and the entire structure could collapse. As Jace rounded the corner of a half-destroyed building, he saw the small alien figure huddled against the wall, her blue skin blending with the dusty, gray environment. Her glowing green eyes met his with a mixture of fear and hope. She was small, fragile, but there was a strength in her gaze that reminded Jace of something he had lost long ago, something he wasn't ready to let go of. You single quotes re ... Human, she asked, her voice faint but steady. Jace nodded, crouching down in front of her. I'm Jace, he said gently. I heard your voice. Luma, the girl, stood slowly, her small fingers pointing to the debris beside her. Mama's under there, she's not moving. Jace's gaze followed the direction of her finger, and his breath caught in his throat. A piece of the ceiling had fallen, and beneath it lay the body of a woman. She was curled protectively around something, her face pale, but Jace could see the faintest rise and fall of her chest. Jace moved quickly, kneeling beside the woman. He checked her pulse, his fingers pressing gently against her throat. A faint beat. She was alive, but barely. He stood slowly, turning to Luma. "What's your name?" he asked softly. Luma hesitated before answering, her eyes focused on the ground. Luma, Esper, Kellen. Jace froze. He had heard that name before, Kellen. It was a name he had never expected to hear again. He turned back to the woman on the ground, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but he didn't have time to think. He had to move. He had to get them out of here, Luma, Jace said, his voice firm. "I'm going to get you both out of here, I promise." A choice in the ruins. The ruins stretched before Jace like a twisted labyrinth, every step weighed down by the eerie silence that hung thick in the air. His breath came in shallow gasps, cutting through the dust as he crouched beside Luma, watched him closely, her wide green eyes filled with both fear and trust. Jace could feel the weight of the moment. This was no longer just a simple rescue mission. There was something deeper at play here, something that connected him to the girl and her mother, something from his own past that he wasn't quite ready to face. Luma's small hand gripped his arm, her tiny fingers trembling. "Are you going to leave us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jace paused. The question cut through him like a knife. Could he leave them? The thought lingered, but it was fleeting. No, he couldn't. The moment he heard her voice on the radio, something had shifted inside him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he was meant to be here. To do this? No, Jace replied firmly, his voice stronger than he felt. "I'm not going to leave you. You have my word." Luma nodded, though her expression remained tense. She glanced over at her mother, her gaze full of concern. Jace turned to the unconscious woman. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, her face pale. She was alive, but only just. Every second counted. Jace's thoughts raced as he quickly scanned his surroundings. The storm outside was worsening, and the toxic dust would soon make it impossible to stay out in the open. He had to act fast. His hand moved to the side of his visor, checking the incoming data from his emergency scanner. The rubble was too heavy to lift alone. Even if he managed to free the woman, getting both her and Luma to safety would take more than just strength. Luma's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Are you going to carry us?" he asked, a trace of hope in her voice. Like ... like a hero. Jace's heart sank. He wasn't a hero. He was just a scavenger, a man who had long since stopped caring about anything other than survival. But in the face of Luma's unwavering faith, something deep inside him stirred. Maybe this was the moment to become something more. "Yeah, Luma," he said, meeting her gaze. "I'll carry you both. We'll make it out together." He moved quickly, adjusting his gear, pulling out the emergency beacon, and activating it. It sent a weak signal into the void, hoping that someone, anyone, would be able to pick it up. But Jace knew better than to place his hopes on the beacon. The chances of someone responding in this wasteland were slim at best. His only option now was to get them out on his own. Jace carefully lifted the woman, her body limp and unresponsive, and draped her across his shoulder. She was heavier than he expected, but he didn't hesitate. With one hand he held her steady, and with the other he grasped Luma's tiny hand. Together they began the slow march through the wreckage. The wind picked up again, howling through the empty streets, carrying with it the biting sting of dust. Jace squinted into the distance, scanning for any sign of safety. In the distance, the half-collapsed buildings loomed like dark shadows, the streets filled with twisted metal and broken glass. Every step felt like it was taking him deeper into the heart of the dead city, but Jace kept moving. Luma's soft voice broke through the howling wind. "Will we be safe?" she asked, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Jace glanced down at her, trying to offer a reassuring smile. "We'll be safe," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. The world around them felt dangerous, the air thick with radiation from the old war. The city was a minefield, and every step forward was a risk. But there was no turning back now. As they moved through the wreckage, Jace's thoughts turned to the woman he carried, Luma's mother. She had been a scientist, someone who had worked alongside humans, but had been abandoned when the war ended. Her story was still a mystery to him, but he could feel the weight of it in the air. She was no ordinary woman. She held secrets, and her daughter Luma was tied to those secrets in ways Jace couldn't yet comprehend. Jace's eyes flicked back to the small silver pendant Luma had shown him earlier. He had seen that face before. The man in the photo was someone from his past, someone he hadn't thought about in years. Captain Kellen. The name rang a bell, but Jace couldn't piece together the details. His memory was a haze, a blur of war and missions that had long since faded into the past. But the connection was undeniable. Luma's father had been part of something bigger, something that had been buried after the war. Jace pushed the thoughts aside for now. There was no time to dwell on the past. They had to survive. They had to get out of the ruins before the storm and the drones found them. The wind howled again, louder this time, and Jace's visor flashed with a red warning. A toxic dust storm was closing in fast. If they didn't find shelter soon, they would be trapped out in the open. He looked around frantically, searching for a safe place to hide. Through the haze, he spotted a building that seemed more intact than the others. It was a short distance away, just beyond the ruins. Jace picked up the pace, his legs burning with the effort, but he didn't stop. Luma's small fingers clenched tighter around his hand as they moved through the wreckage. As they reached the building, Jace set the woman down gently against the wall, careful not to jostle her too much. He checked her vitals again. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. "We're going to be okay," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. Luma looked up at him with wide eyes, her face filled with a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "Is Mama going to wake up?" Jace paused, glancing at the woman whose eyes were still closed. "She will. We just have to wait. I'll keep you both safe." The storm was closing in now, the winds howling like ghosts. The sky turned an eerie shade of orange as dust began to swirl around them. Jace stood up and looked around. There was no sign of the drones yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they came. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any movement. It was only a matter of time before the worst came. Luma's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Are you scared?" Jace met her gaze, his expression softening. "Yeah," he admitted, "but not for me, for you." Luma smiled, faintly, her small fingers gripping his hand tightly. "Don't worry, Jace," she whispered. "We'll be okay. I know it." For the first time in a long while, Jace allowed himself to believe in something other than survival. He looked down at Luma and her mother, the only family she had left in this broken world. He didn't know what would come next. But one thing was clear, they were in this together, no matter what. The dangerous path ahead. Jace's eyes lingered on the storm clouds swirling above, the orange hue of the sky casting a strange glow over the ruins. His boots dug into the crumbling ground as he crouched next to Luma and her unconscious mother, listening to the eerie quiet that surrounded them. The toxic dust storm was nearing, and the temperature was dropping with every passing minute. The walls of the abandoned building they had taken refuge in provided little comfort, just the fragile shelter of broken walls and rusted metal. Jace took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation pressing in on him. The woman he had carried from the rubble still lay unconscious, her breath shallow but steady. Luma sat beside her, clutching the blanket Jace had wrapped her in, her small hands trembling. The wind outside rattled the broken windows of the old building, as if trying to push its way inside, to tear everything apart. Luma's voice broke the silence, soft and fearful. "Jace, will Mama be okay?" Jace's heart sank. He didn't know. He didn't know if she would wake up, or if the storm would claim them before they had a chance to leave this cursed place. But he couldn't show her his doubt. "Not now, she will be," he said, his voice more certain than he felt. "We just need to stay calm. Help is coming." Luma looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if no one comes?" Jace's breath caught. "Someone will come," he repeated, more for himself than for her. The truth was, his hope was flickering like a candle in the wind. The pulse beacon he had sent out was weak, the signal barely strong enough to reach beyond the ruins, but he had to believe it would work. They had no other choice. The wind outside picked up, howling through the open cracks in the building's walls. Jace's eyes darted to the scanning device on his wrist. A small light flickered. The storm was fast approaching, and the signal from the beacon was already starting to fade. If no one answered soon, the situation would become dire. Luma shifted. Beside him, her small fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. "Jace, I want to go home." The words hit Jace like a punch to the gut. Home. This place. These ruins, where no one's home anymore. Not for Luma, not for her mother, and not for him. But he couldn't let her see the hopelessness in his eyes. "We're getting out of here, Luma," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "I promised you I wouldn't leave, and I'm not going to." As he spoke, Jace's mind raced. The mother had to wake up. They needed her strength, her knowledge, but she lay there, as lifeless as the wreckage around them. He couldn't help but wonder what she knew, what secrets she carried in that unconscious body of hers. Luma had said her mother had worked with humans before the war, but she also spoke of betrayal. Jace didn't know the full story, but whatever it was, it had led them here, to this dead zone where even the ghosts of the past dared not linger. He glanced at the small pendant Luma had shown him earlier, the face of a man he thought he would never see again, Captain Kellen. A war hero, a man whose legacy had been buried along with the war itself. Jace hadn't thought about the captain in years, but now, with Luma's mother lying unconscious beside him, Jace couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their story. Luma caught him staring at the pendant again. "That's my papa," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "Mama said he was a good man, but I never met him. She said he died before I was born." Jace stared at the pendant, his fingers clenched around his wrist. The captain's face looked so familiar, as if the answer was right there, waiting to be uncovered, but the more he thought about it, the more tangled the threads became. He couldn't afford to dwell on it. There were more immediate problems to face. Suddenly, the radio crackled again, a low hum breaking the silence. Jace's heart leaped. He grabbed the receiver, pressing it to his ear. "Jace, are you there?" The voice was faint but unmistakable. Was the rescue team. Someone had heard the pulse beacon. Jace's breath caught in his throat. This was it. Help was finally on the way. "I'm here," Jace said, his voice filled with relief. "I've got 2 survivors, a woman and her daughter. They need help fast. We're in the old ruin zone, near Zone Red 7. I've got them holed up in an old building." There was a pause, and then a crackle of static. "Hold tight, Jace. We're coming for you. Stay where you are." Jace almost collapsed with relief. His grip on the radio tightened as he fought back the rush of emotions flooding through him. He had done it. He had kept his promise. Help was on the way. But then, just as quickly as the hope had arrived, it was gone. A faint beep from his wrist scanner. "A warning, they're not alone," Jace muttered under his breath. He looked over at Luma and her mother, his eyes narrowing. The faint signal he had received wasn't from the rescue team. It was from something else, something close. Scanner showed several movement patterns near their location. Not humans, not allies, drones. He pulled Luma closer, his heart racing. "We've got to move, now." Luma's eyes were wide with fear. "What's happening?" "The drones," Jace said, scanning the area again. "They've found us." Outside, the wind howled again, the storm now a roaring beast. Jace could hear the mechanical hum of the drones, their red eyes scanning the area. They were getting closer, faster. Jace looked at the unconscious woman. He had to move. He had no choice. "I need you to stay close to me, Luma," he said, his voice low but firm. "And don't make a sound." She nodded, gripping his hand tightly as they moved deeper into the building, finding what little shelter they could, but it wouldn't be enough. The drones were coming. The search for truth. The moment the wind howled louder, Jace's instincts kicked in. He moved quickly, his boots scraping against the crumbled concrete as he lifted the unconscious woman into his arms once more. The moment felt like it was frozen in time, every second stretching into eternity. His hand, steady but tense, gripped the woman's shoulder, while his other arm held Luma's tiny, trembling hand. They couldn't stay here. The drones were closing in fast, their cold mechanical hum vibrating through the ruins, growing louder and louder. "Stay low," Jace whispered, pulling Luma close. His heart was pounding in his chest. He glanced quickly around the building, searching for a way out. The front door was too exposed, but there was a small service entrance at the back, one that led into an old alleyway. If they could make it there without being spotted, they might have a chance. The storm outside had intensified, and the dust swirling through the broken windows made it hard to see anything clearly. The visibility was low, the perfect cover for a quick escape, but it also meant that drones would have the advantage of silence, their sensors capable of picking up the faintest movement. Jace's grip on the woman tightened, and he motioned for Luma to stay as close as possible. They needed to be invisible, like shadows. "Don't make a sound," Jace repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Luma nodded, her small form pressed close. To him, her mother, still unconscious, lay limply across Jace's shoulders, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. He could feel the weight of her body, and the weight of the promise he had made to them both. The promise to keep them safe. They crept toward the back of the building, every movement deliberate and silent. The drone's sensors pinged on Jace's scanner, the readings flashing like an alarm in his mind. They were close, too close. He quickened his pace, knowing that the moment they were seen, all hope of survival would be lost. A sudden sound outside, a mechanical whir, made him stop dead in his tracks. It wasn't a drone, but something far worse. Jace's breath caught in his throat. He could hear voices now, muffled and distant, but unmistakable. Soldiers. His body tensed, muscles coiling, ready for action. He quickly crouched, ducking into a narrow alcove with the woman and Luma pulling them close to the cracked walls. The shadows here would conceal them, but only for a short time. If the soldiers got any closer, there would be no escape. Luma's breath was shallow, her eyes wide with fear. but she didn't make a sound. She was good at staying quiet, just like Jace had taught her. He looked down at her, trying to offer her some comfort, but his mind was racing. What did they want, and how could they have found them so quickly? "They're looking for us," Luma whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Why?" Jace didn't answer immediately. His mind was too busy calculating their next move. Soldiers were getting closer, their heavy footsteps echoing through the broken buildings. He could hear them barking orders to each other, but their words were indistinguishable through the storm. Whatever they were here for, it wasn't good, and it was clear they weren't leaving without something or someone. Jace clenched his jaw, glancing around frantically. There was no way out. The alley was a dead end, the soldiers closing in on their location, but Jace wasn't about to give up. He needed to get them out of here. He couldn't afford to lose them. Not now, not after everything he had promised. Glanced down at Luma, her face pale, but determined. She was a fighter, just like him, but they were running out of options. Then he saw it. A small maintenance tunnel, just barely visible behind a pile of rubble. It wasn't much, but it was. A way out. He pulled Luma closer and signaled to her to follow him. Her eyes widened with understanding, and without a word, she squeezed his hand tighter. Jace ducked low, moving as quickly as possible toward the tunnel entrance. Every instinct screamed at him to hurry, but every step felt like it might be there. Last, the storm outside howled louder, and the wind whipped against the walls, adding to the chaos. The soldiers were almost on them now, their voices growing more distinct. "We'll never make it through that tunnel," Luma whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "Yes, we will," Jace said firmly. "Stay close to me, and don't make a sound." They reached a tunnel entrance, and Jace quickly shoved aside the debris blocking the way. The small hole was barely big enough for him to fit, but it was their only chance. He slipped through first, cradling the woman in his arms, and Luma followed closely behind. The dark tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the air stale and thick with the scent of decay. But Jace didn't stop. He moved through it with purpose, his mind focused only on one thing, getting them to safety. The tunnel led them to a small maintenance room, dimly lit by a flickering overhead light. Jace quickly set the woman down on the cold metal floor, and took a moment to catch his breath. His muscles burned, and the adrenaline was starting to wear off. But there was no time to rest. They had to keep moving. Luma sat next to her mother, her small hand resting on her mother's limp fingers. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked quietly. Jace didn't answer right away. He had checked the woman's vitals once more, but there was still no change. Her breathing was shallow, and her pulse was weak. It was getting harder to keep his optimism. The longer she stayed unconscious, the more he feared the worst. But he couldn't give up now, not after everything they had been through. "We need to get out of here," Jace said finally. "We can't stay in one place for too long. The soldiers will find us eventually." He stood up and moved to the far side of the room, checking the exit routes. There was a door that led to the outside, but it was risky. They would have to cross open ground to reach the safety of the old outpost. If the soldiers were still tracking them, they wouldn't last long out there. He turned back to Luma, who was still sitting by her mother's side. "Listen to me, Luma. I'm going to get us out of here. Just trust me." Luma looked up at him, her small face filled with uncertainty. "You promise?" Jace nodded, a fierce determination in his eyes. "I promise." He reached down and helped Luma stand, then carefully lifted the woman into his arms again. He could feel the weight of her body, but it wasn't just physical. The weight of his promise to them both was even heavier. He had to get them to safety. There was no turning back now. The path to the outpost, the world outside, was a relentless expanse of dust and destruction. Jace's boots crunched against the cracked floor as he moved cautiously through the dark maintenance room. The flickering light above only emphasized the eerie silence around them. Luma clung to his side, her eyes wide with fear, constantly looking over her shoulder. Her mother, still unconscious, lay in Jace's arms, her body feeling unnervingly fragile as he carried her from one perilous place to another. They had no time to waste. "We need to keep moving," Jace muttered to himself as much as to Luma. He felt the weight of the responsibility in his arms, not just of the woman but of the promise he had made to both of them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about hope for them, for humanity, for a world that had forgotten how to care. As they crept through the narrow corridors of the maintenance building, Jace's heart pounded in his chest. His pulse, once steady, was now quick and erratic. Each shadow that moved in the distance set his nerves on edge. The drones, the soldiers, they were out there. The quiet storm of danger surrounding them seemed to heighten with every passing second. "Where are we going?" Luma asked in a whisper, her voice trembling but steady. She was scared, Jace could see it in her eyes, but she trusted him. "There's a place," Jace said, his voice low. "A safe spot, or at least safer than this. An old human outpost. If we get there, I can send a signal for help." Luma nodded, but Jace could see the uncertainty in her face. "Will anyone come?" she asked. Jace didn't know. He wished he could promise her that they would be safe, that help would be waiting at the outpost, but he knew better. The war had left a scar on everything, especially the human-alien relationships that had once seemed so full of potential. There were factions out there, people who didn't want the war to end, people who wanted to use them, both humans and aliens alike. But the signal was their only hope. "Yes," Jace said with as much certainty as he could muster. "Someone will come." The tunnels twisted, leading them deeper into the labyrinth of forgotten machinery and lost technology. The dark, narrow corridors felt suffocating, and the closer they got to the exit, the more tense Jace became. Every creak of the building, every strange noise in the distance made his heart race faster. The back of the building was still standing, but barely. The path outside was now clear. It was a small courtyard, littered with rubble, surrounded by decaying walls. This was where the real danger lay. The exit they had to cross was open and exposed. No cover, no hiding places, just the harsh wind, and the distant hum of drones on patrol. Jace peered cautiously around the corner of the building, scanning for movement. A faint shadow flickered across the courtyard. His stomach tightened. "They're out there," he muttered under his breath. "The drones are scanning the area. If we stay here too long, they'll find us." Luma looked up at him, her face filled with a quiet kind of determination. "We can do this," she said softly, her voice small but fierce. "We have to." Jace smiled at her, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He couldn't allow himself to falter now. "We will," he said, his voice resolute. He adjusted the woman in his arms, the weight of her growing with each step, and motioned for Luma to stay close. He had a plan. It wasn't a perfect one, but it was all they had. They moved as quickly as they could, darting between the decaying structures, sticking to the shadows and using every bit of cover they could find. Jace's mind was calculating each move, his training kicking in as he kept his eyes peeled for any signs of movement. The storm outside was almost deafening now, but it provided some semblance of cover. The drones wouldn't be able to see them clearly in the swirling dust, but they would still be able to detect movement. "Stay low," Jace whispered as they reached the edge of the courtyard. He crouched, watching the skies. The drones were moving closer now, their red lights sweeping over the area like predators searching for prey. Luma held her breath, her hand squeezing his tightly. "What if they see us?" "They won't," Jace said, though his voice was filled with uncertainty. He had to believe that. He had no other choice. Dart. As they crouched in the rubble, the faint whir of a drone's engine grew louder. Jace's heart raced. A drone was getting closer, its sensors scanning the courtyard methodically. A bead of sweat dripped down Jace's temple as he looked at the small gap between the wrecked walls. The drone passed just inches from their hiding place, its red light sweeping over the rubble where they were hidden. Jace held his breath. Luma didn't make a sound, but Jace could feel her trembling against him. The drone hovered for a moment, its engines buzzing as if it was about to turn back. Jace could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Then, as if by some miracle, the drone moved on, its sensors clicking softly as it shifted away into the distance. Jace exhaled slowly, his pulse still hammering in his chest. "That was too close," he whispered. "But we're almost there." Luma nodded, though she still looked terrified. "What now?" Jace peeked over the wreckage once more, his eyes scanning the area ahead. The old outpost was just beyond the next line of buildings. It was a broken place, but it still held a faint flicker of hope. Jace had worked there once, years ago, and he knew the place well enough to trust that the old signal relays would still work, even if it was just a slim chance. "We run," Jace said. "No stopping. We make it to the outpost, then we send the signal." He stood up slowly, checking the path ahead one last time. The courtyard was quiet again, but the sense of danger still hung thick in the air. The wind picked up, whipping around them like the breath of some ancient beast. He motioned for Luma to follow him and gently lifted the woman into his arms again. She was heavier than he remembered, and with each step the weight grew, not just physically, but emotionally. He had made promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Together they moved forward, carefully stepping over the broken ground, crossing the gap between the buildings. Jace's breath caught in his throat as he scanned the area for any signs of the drones. They were so close now, closer than he had ever thought they'd get. Jace's eyes fixed on the entrance to the old outpost, barely visible through the storm, as the last of his hope flickered. He could do this. They would do this. He had to make it work. Luma was right behind him, and as they reached the outpost's door, Jace quickly pushed it open, ushering them inside. The building was old, its lights flickering weakly, but it was safe for now. Jace placed the woman down gently, her breath still shallow but steady. He turned to Luma. "Stay here. I'll send the signal. We're almost there." Luma nodded, sitting beside her mother. "Hurry," she whispered. "Please." Jace didn't waste another second. He moved quickly to the old communications panel and flicked the switches, his hands shaking as he connected to the emergency network. The screen flashed with static, but slowly, the connection stabilized. He entered the coordinates and sent the distress signal. As the signal pulsed, Jace watched the screen, waiting for the answer. There was nothing yet. The silence in the room, pressed in, suffocating. Then, a light blinked on the screen. The signal was received. His heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone anymore, but the storm outside was still raging, and the drones were closing in. They had only moments before the worst arrived. A new hope amidst the storm. Jace's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the flickering screen, the faint pulse of the distress signal slowly being processed. The hum of static filled the small, dimly lit room, the only sound breaking through the thick tension that hung in the air. The dust storm outside raged, its howling winds rattling the walls of the old outpost. Time was running out. Luma sat beside her mother, her small hands clutching the edge of the emergency blanket. Her eyes locked on Jace, her face filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Jace could feel the weight of her gaze, the quiet plea in her eyes. He had promised them both that he would get them out, but now, as the silence stretched between the beeps of the communication device, doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. The storm outside raged, but the room remained eerily calm, save for the faint buzz of the equipment. Jace's hands trembled slightly as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. The pressure was mounting, and the heavy burden of responsibility pressed down on him like the crumbling walls of the ruin they had just escaped. His fingers hovered over the keys, the last hope flashing on the screen. The transmission had gone through, but there was no confirmation yet. Nothing. It was a waiting game now, one that could end with salvation or destruction. Luma's voice broke through the quiet. "Jace," her voice was small, barely above a whisper. "What if they don't come?" Jace didn't look at her. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on the screen, willing it to respond, willing the universe to grant them a chance at life. "They'll come," he said, his voice rough. "They have to." The room was filled with a hum of energy, a pulse of anticipation. Jace's pulse mirrored the steady thrum of the devices. He glanced back at Luma and her mother. The woman was still unconscious, but her breathing had steadied. Her pulse, while faint, was stronger than before. She was fighting, and so was Jace. Suddenly, the screen flickered, and a low tone echoed from the device. Jace's breath caught as a message finally blinked onto the screen. "Signal received. Deploying retrieval team." Jace's heart stopped for a moment, then surged forward with new life. They weren't alone. They weren't forgotten, Luma, Jace said, his voice now stronger, tinged with the first rays of hope he had allowed himself to feel in days. "They're coming. Help is on the way." Luma's eyes widened, and a tentative smile broke across her face. She didn't speak, but her relief was palpable. She nodded slowly, her tiny hand reaching out to grasp her mother's cold fingers, her other hand tightly clutching the corner of the blanket. Jace took a deep breath, his hands still slightly shaking, but his mind racing with a new sense of purpose. They had a chance, but that chance would come with risks. The drones were still out there, still scanning the area. The storm outside was far from over, and the worst of it could still hit. The signal from the outpost had gone out, but the location was no longer secure. There was no time to waste. "They'll be here soon," Jace said, stepping back toward the doorway. "But we can't stay here. We have to move." Luma looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Where do we go?" Jace scanned the room once more, the dim light from the emergency lights flickering faintly as he moved toward the far corner. "There's a back exit. It's a shortcut to the canyon. If we can get there, we'll be far enough from the drones. And the storm, it's our best chance." Without another word, he moved toward the exit, carefully navigating around the damaged equipment and debris scattered throughout the room. The back exit, which had been hidden in plain sight, was a narrow, rusted door that led into a small tunnel. It was barely large enough for a person to move through, but it was their only chance to escape without being spotted. Jace opened the door carefully, wincing at the creak of the metal, and motioned for Luma and her mother to follow. The young girl hesitated for a moment, but then stood up, her small hand reaching for her mother as she gently lifted the woman into her arms. Jace couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration for Luma. She was so much stronger than anyone could have ever known, so much stronger than Jace had been at her age. As they moved into the tunnel, Jace felt the weight of every moment pressing down on him. The air was stale and damp, but it was safe for now. The storm's roar muffled in the distance, and the steady hum of the drones was faint, lost to the outside world. They moved quickly, but Jace knew they couldn't afford to waste time. The deeper they went, the closer they came to their goal. The canyon, a natural barrier that had once provided safety for travelers and outcasts. If they could make it to the other side, they could rest and wait for the retrieval team to find them. But that was a big if. That as they reached the end of the tunnel, Jace could hear the faint sound of footsteps. Someone was outside. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as his instincts flared. He held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. The soft sound of voices, too muffled to make out, reached him from beyond the entrance. Jace's heart sank. "More soldiers," he muttered. "They found us." Luma's eyes were wide with fear, her small body trembling. "What do we do?" Jace's eyes flicked to the narrow opening of the tunnel, where light filtered through the cracks in the rusted metal door. He turned to Luma and her mother. "Stay here. I'm going to take a look." Without waiting for a response, Jace moved toward the entrance, his steps careful and silent. His eyes scanned the shadows outside. The soldiers were close. He could see the outline of their figures moving in the dust, their helmets glinting in the dim light. The drones hovered nearby, their red lights scanning the perimeter. But Jace wasn't ready to give up yet. He had a choice to make: stay hidden or fight back. The silence was deafening. He waited for just a moment, weighing his options. If he could just make it to the outposts he could signal the team early and get them to safety. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on: the enemy's persistence. Jace adjusted his weapon, the cold metal reassuring against his grip. It wasn't just about survival anymore. He was fighting for Luma, for her mother, and for a future beyond this endless cycle of war and despair. His pulse steady, Jace moved forward into the shadows. The final stand. The wind outside roared like a beast, relentless and furious, sending blasts of toxic dust swirling through the air. Jace crouched behind a pile of rubble, his breath shallow and his heart racing. The canyon loomed just ahead, a narrow passage that would lead them to safety. But it was too far, too open, and the enemy was closing in. He had no choice but to make a stand. Luma and her mother, now both awake but still fragile, huddled behind a crumbling wall, their eyes wide with fear. Jace could feel their fear, but he couldn't afford to show any of his own. Not now, not when they were so close. "Stay here," he said quietly, his voice firm but low, so as not to alert the enemy. Luma nodded, but there was something in her eyes, a trust that both terrified and inspired him. She didn't know the full weight of the danger they were in, but she trusted him to protect her. Jace adjusted the weapon on his side, the cool metal of his sidearm a constant reminder of the choices he'd had to make. He had been many things in his life: a soldier, a scavenger, a survivor. But right now, none of those labels mattered. All that mattered was getting them out. The world outside had gone dark, and the storm in the canyon wasn't the only thing they had to fear. The soldiers were here, and they weren't leaving without a fight. The ground beneath Jace's boots was unstable, but he moved quickly, staying low. His eyes flicked to the sky, where the faint hum of drones still lingered, their sensors scanning the area with mechanical precision. He could hear the soldiers' footsteps growing closer, the sound of their heavy boots scraping against the dirt. He reached for his wrist scanner, checking the location of the retrieval team. They were still a few minutes out, but it wouldn't be enough if the soldiers found them first. Jace's mind raced, calculating their best route, but there were too many variables. If he stayed hidden, they might make it. If he tried to fight, they might be overwhelmed. But Jace had already made his decision. He stepped forward, his weapon raised, the weight of it familiar in his hands. His breath steadied as he focused on the task ahead. The soldiers were getting closer, and he needed to act fast. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Just as he rounded the corner, he spotted them: for soldiers, their black armor blending into the shadows. Moving methodically through the rubble, they were searching for signs of life, scanning every nook and cranny for any trace of their quarry. Their red-lit visors flickered with cold precision. Jace's mind worked quickly. He had to disable them, but the element of surprise was on his side. The wind howled again, giving him just enough cover to make his move. He fired a quick shot, aimed low. The sound was muffled by the storm, but it was enough. One of the soldiers crumpled to the ground with a sharp gasp, his body hitting the dirt. With a sickening thud, the others spun around, startled, but it was too late. Jace moved fast, using the momentum of his shot to close the distance. Another shot rang out, but this time, it was different. It was louder, sharper. The soldier closest to him fell with a grunt, a quick flash of light marking the end of his life. The remaining two soldiers reacted in an instant, their weapons raised, their red-lit eyes scanning for any sign of movement, but Jace wasn't done. He moved swiftly, his body a blur as he sprinted toward the last two soldiers, his gun aimed, his breath steady. The wind whipped around him, making every motion feel like a fight against nature itself. His muscles burned, his heart pounded in his chest, but he was focused. The soldiers fired first, their shots wild, but Jace was faster. He ducked low, rolling behind a broken pillar, narrowly avoiding their fire. His own shot rang out, striking the first soldier in the chest. The second soldier turned, but Jace was already on top of him, using his weight to knock the man to the ground. The two struggled, the soldier's hands reaching for his weapon, but Jace was relentless. With a swift, calculated move, Jace disarmed him, knocking the soldier's gun from his hand and using the element of surprise to pin him to the ground. The soldier struggled beneath him, but it was over. Jace didn't wait for the soldier to make another move. He put an end to it with one final, decisive strike. Panting, Jace stood, surveying the fallen soldiers. His chest heaved, but he didn't take a moment to rest. The drones were still out there, searching, circling, and the retrieval team wouldn't be far behind. They had to keep moving. He turned to Luma and her mother, who had been watching from behind the cover. Luma's eyes were wide with awe and fear, but there was a flicker of gratitude in her gaze. The woman, still fragile, nodded at him, her silent gratitude heavier than words could express. "We're not out of this yet," Jace said, his voice a low growl of determination. "But we're close." Luma nodded, her small fingers gripping his arm tightly. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small but full of resolve. Jace didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, signaling for them to follow him. "We make a run for the canyon. We're almost there." As they began to move, the air felt charged with an electric tension. The wind howled louder, and the storm picked up again. But this time, it wasn't just a physical storm. It was a storm of uncertainty, of fear, and of survival. Every step they took toward the canyon was a step closer to the unknown. But it was a step away from everything that had tried to break them. The canyon was ahead, just a few more miles, but Jace knew they had no time to waste. The storm outside and the soldiers on their trail meant they would need to move fast. But it wasn't just the storm and the soldiers that were closing in on them. It was the truth, a truth that Jace wasn't ready to face, but one that had already begun to reveal itself. Luma's mother had been part of something bigger, something that went beyond the war, beyond the betrayal. And as they moved closer to the canyon, Jace felt the weight of that truth pressing in on him, the truth of the past and the future that they were now walking toward.